Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos held the Guinness World Record for the largest ever theft from a government for decades, although Guinness took the record down from their website, while it underwent periodic review a few weeks before the 2022 Philippine presidential elections. Early life Ferdinand Marcos was born on September 11, 1917, in the town of Sarat, Ilocos Norte, to Mariano Marcos, 1897 to 1945, and Josefa Edralin, 1893 to 1988. Mariano Marcos was a lawyer and congressman from Ilocos Norte, Philippines. He was executed by Filipino guerrillas in 1945 as a Japanese propagandist and collaborator during World War II. Drawn and quartered with the use of carabaos, his remains were left hanging on a tree. Josefa Marcos was a schoolteacher who outlived her husband, dying in 1988, 2 years after the Marcos family fled into exile following the 1986 People Power Revolution, 1 year before Ferdinand's death. Marcos claimed that he was a descendant of Antonio Luna, a Filipino general during the Philippine-American War, a claim since debunked by genealogist Mona Magnoveluz. He also claimed that his ancestor was a 16th century pirate Limahong, Chinese, Lianfeng, who used to raid the coast of the South China Sea. He is a Chinese mestizo descendant. Education Marcos studied law at the University of the Philippines in Manila, attending the College of Law. He excelled in both curricular and extracurricular activities, joining the university's swimming, boxing, and wrestling teams. He was an accomplished orator, debater, and writer for the student newspaper. While attending up College of Law, he joined Upsilon Sigma Phi, where he met his future colleagues in government and some of his staunchest critics. Marcos attended the Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC. He served as an ROTC battalion commander and was commissioned as a 3rd lieutenant apprentice officer in the Philippine Constabulary Reserve. He was a member of the rifle team and a national rifle champion. When he sat for the 1939 bar examinations, he was a top scorer with a score of 92.35%. He graduated cum laude and was in the top 10 of his class. Future Chief Justice Felix Macazier was their class salutatorian. He was elected to the Pi Gamma Mu and the Phi Kappa Phi International Honor Societies, the latter giving him its most distinguished member award 37 years later. Ferdinand Marcos being conferred with a Doctor of Laws, honoris causa degree during the investiture of the first Filipino president of Central Philippine University, Rex D. Edralin, on April 21, 1967. Marcos received an honorary Doctor of Laws, degree in 1967 from Central Philippine University. Julio Nalandaizon assassination. Julio Nalandaizon was a Filipino lawyer and politician and a political rival of Mariano Marcos. He was killed with a single rifle shot at his home in Batac on September 21, 1935, the day after he had defeated Marcos a second time for a seat in the National Assembly. In December 1938, Ferdinand Marcos, his father Mariano, and his uncles, Pio Marcos and Quirino Lizardo, were accused of murder. According to 2 witnesses, the 4 had conspired to assassinate Nalandaizon. Ferdinand was a member of the University of the Philippines rifle team and a national rifle champion. Marcos's rifle was in its gun rack in the ROTC armory, that of Team Captain Teodoro M. Calao Jr. was missing. The National Bureau of Investigation obtained evidence that Calao's rifle was the murder weapon. Ferdinand had access to the armory. Ferdinand and Lizardo were then convicted of the murder. Ferdinand was sentenced to 10 to 17 years in prison. Marcos appealed to the Supreme Court of the Philippines. Justice Jose P. Laurel, who wrote the majority decision, had almost killed a rival during a youthful brawl. He was convicted by a trial court of frustrated murder, but was acquitted after his own appeal to the Supreme Court. Laurel pleaded for his colleagues to acquit. After serving in the House for 3 terms, Marcos won a Senate seat in 1959 and became Senate Minority Floor Leader in 1960. He became Executive Vice President of the Liberal Party and served as party president from 1961 to 1964. From 1963 to 1965, he was Senate President. He introduced significant bills, many of which were enacted. Presidential campaign Ferdinand Marcos is sworn into his first term on December 30th, 1965. Marcos ran a populist campaign emphasizing that he was a medal war hero. In 1962, Marcos claimed to be the most decorated war hero of the Philippines by garnering almost every medal and decoration that the Filipino and American governments had established. Included in his claim of 27 war medals and decorations were the Distinguished Service Cross and the Medal of Honor. The opposition Liberal Party later confirmed that many of his war medals were awarded in 1962 to aid in his Senate election campaign. As a result, Marcos won the election. Administration and cabinet presidential styles of Ferdinand Marcos reference style, His Excellency spoken style, Your Excellency alternative style, Mr. President first term, 1965 to 1969. Marcos was inaugurated as the 10th President of the Philippines on December 30th, 1965. He launched an aggressive program of infrastructure development funded by foreign loans. He remained popular for most of his first term, although his popularity flagged after debt-driven spending triggered an inflationary crisis in November and December 1969. Major projects included the construction of the Cultural Center of the Philippines complex, which is considered one of the earliest examples of what became known as the Marcos' Edifice Complex. Marcos developed close relations with Philippine military officers and began expanding the armed forces by allowing loyal generals to stay in their positions past retirement age or by giving them government posts. He gained the support of the U.S. Johnson administration by allowing Philippine involvement in the Vietnam War via the Philippine Civic Action Group. Marcos' first term saw the expose of the Jibita massacre in March 1968, where Jibin Edralin, a Muslim, testified that he had been the lone survivor of a group of Moro Army recruits executed en masse on Corregidor Island on March 18, 1968. The allegations became a major flashpoint that ignited the Moro insurgency. Defense expansion, one of President Marcos' earliest initiatives, was to significantly expand the Philippine military. In an unprecedented move, Marcos chose to concurrently serve as his own defense secretary, giving him direct control over the military. He significantly increased the defense budget, also using it for civil projects such as school construction. Marcos' policies led Senator Benigno Aquino Jr. to accuse him in 1968 of trying to establish a garrison state. Vietnam War under intense pressure from the Johnson administration, Marcos reversed his prior position of not sending Philippine forces to Vietnam, consenting to limited involvement. He then asked Congress to approve sending a combat engineer unit. Despite opposition, the proposal was approved and Philippine troops were involved from the middle of 1966 as the Philippine Civic Action Group, PhilCAG. PhilCAG grew to a strength of some 1,600 troops in 1968. Between 1966 and 1970, over 10,000 Filipino soldiers served in Vietnam, mainly involved in civilian infrastructure projects. Loans for construction projects attempting to become the first president of the Third Republic to be reelected, Marcos began taking massive foreign loans to fund the rice, roads, and school buildings he promised in his re-election campaign. With tax revenues inadequate to fund his 70% increase in infrastructure spending from 1966 to 1970, Marcos covered the gap with loans, creating a budget deficit 72% higher than the Philippine government's annual deficit from 1961 to 1965. Marcos was re-elected on November 11, 1969, in a landslide. He was the only Filipino president to win a second full term. His running mate, incumbent Vice President Fernando Lopez, was also elected to a third full term as Vice President of the Philippines. Marcos' second term was characterized by social unrest, beginning with the balance of payments crisis. Opposition groups began to form, with moderate groups calling for political reform and radical groups espousing radical left ideology. Marcos responded with military force. The most notable response was to protests during the first 3 months of 1970, a period known as the First Quarter Storm. Another major event was the Philippine Constitutional Convention of 1971. In May 1972, a delegate exposed a bribery scheme in which delegates were paid to vote in favor of the Marcoses, implicating Imelda Marcos. On August 21, 1971, a fatal bombing occurred at a political campaign rally of the opposition Liberal Party at Plaza Miranda in Quiapo, Manila. Marcos blamed the Communist Party of the Philippines. He issued Proclamation No. 889, through which he assumed emergency powers and suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Oppositionists were accused of being radicals and were arrested. This response ignored any distinction between moderates and radicals, a distinction that had already blurred during the first quarter storm. The heavy-handed response led to a massive expansion of the underground socialist resistance, with many moderate oppositionists joining the radicals. In 1972, a series of bombings in Metro Manila occurred. Marcos again blamed the communists, although the only suspects caught were linked to the Philippine constabulary. Marcos' second term effectively ended less than 2 years and 9 months later, when he established martial law. Social unrest after the balance of payments crisis Marcos' spending during the campaign triggered growing public unrest, and opposition figures such as Senator Lorenzo Tanada, Senator Jovito Salonga, and Senator Jose W. Diokno accused him of wanting to stay in power beyond the 2-term constitutional limit. Opposition groups quickly grew on campuses. Moderate and radical. Opposition media reports classified the various civil society groups opposing Marcos into either moderates or radicals. The moderates included church groups, civil libertarians, and nationalist politicians who wanted political reforms. Radicals included labor and student groups who sought more systemic political reforms. Moderate statesmen and politicians opposed to the increasingly authoritarian administration mostly focused their efforts on political reforms. Their concerns usually included election reform, calls for a nonpartisan constitutional convention, and demands for Marcos to comply with the constitutional term limit. Proponents included the National Union of Students in the Philippines, the National Students League, and later the Movement of Concerned Citizens for Civil Liberties, MCCCL, led by Senator Jose W. Diokno. MCCCL rallies were remembered for their diversity, attracting both moderate and radical supporters, and for their scale, with as many as 50,000 people in attendance. Radicals, the other broad category of opposition groups, were those who sought more systemic political reforms, usually as part of the national democracy movement. The Marcos administration grouped moderate organizations under a broader radical umbrella. Groups considered radical by the media included Kabataang Makabayan KM, Samahang Demokratiko ng Kabataan SCK, Student Cultural Association of the University of the Philippines SCAUP, Movement for Democratic Philippines MDP, Student Power Assembly of the Philippines SPAP, Malayang Pagkakaisa ng Kabatang Pilipino MPKP, radicalization when Marcos became president. His policies operated within a post-war geopolitical framework. The Philippines was caught up in the anti-communist scare perpetuated by the U.S. during the Cold War. Marcos and the armed forces of the Philippines claimed that the Communist Party of the Philippines was a threat, even though it was still a small organization. Richard J. Kessler noted that Marcos mythologized the group, investing it with a revolutionary aura that only attracted more supporters. The unrest of 1969 to 1970 and the violent response to the first quarter storm protests were watershed events that radicalized many Filipino students in the 1970s against Marcos. Many students who had previously held moderate positions, i.e., calling for legislative reforms, came to believe that more radical social change was required. Other events that further radicalized moderates included the February 1971 Diliman Commune, the August 1971 suspension of the writ of habeas corpus in the wake of the Plaza Miranda bombing, the September 1972 declaration of martial law, the 1980 murder of Maclan G. Dulag, and the August 1983 assassination of Ninoy Aquino. By 1970, campus study sessions on Marxism, Leninism had become common, and many students joined organizations associated with the national democracy movement, such as the Student Cultural Association of the University of the Philippines, SCAUP, and the Kabatang Makabayan KM Lit. Patriotic Youth. Founded by Jose Maria Sison, the Samahang Demokratiko ng Kabataan SDK was founded by a group of young writers. The line between leftist activists and communists became blurred, as a significant number of radicalized activists joined the Communist Party of the Philippines. Many radicalized activists from urban areas were later deployed in rural regions, with some becoming guerrillas. First quarter storm by the time Marcos gave his State of the Nation address on January 26, 1970, demonstrations, protests, and marches had broken out. Both moderate and radical student groups drove these protests, which lasted until the end of the university semester in March 1970, and came to be known as the First Quarter Storm. During Marcos's address, the Moderate National Union of Students of the Philippines organized a protest in front of Congress and invited other student groups to join. Some protesters hurled a coffin, a stuffed alligator, and stones at Marcos and Imelda as they left the Congress building. The next major protest took place on January 30th in front of the presidential palace. Activists broke through the gate with a fire truck and charged the palace grounds, throwing rocks, pillboxes, and Molotov cocktails. At least 2 activists were confirmed dead, and several were injured by the police. 5 more major protests occurred around Manila before March 17th, 1970 later branded by some media as the 7 deadly protests of the First Quarter Storm. These included rallies on February 12th, a February 18th rally that proceeded to the U.S. Embassy, where protesters set fire to the lobby, a Second People's Congress demonstration on February 26th, a People's March on March 3rd, and a second People's March on March 17th. The protests attracted between 50,000 and 100,000 people. Many students declared a week-long boycott of classes and instead gathered to organize rallies. Violent dispersals of protests radicalized Filipino students against the Marcos administration. Constitutional Convention of 1971 civil society groups and opposition leaders began campaigning in 1967 to initiate a constitutional convention. On March 16th that year, the Philippine Congress made itself into a constituent assembly and passed Resolution No. 2, which called for a constitutional convention. Marcos was surprised by his critics by endorsing the move. Historians later noted that he was hoping the convention would allow presidents to serve for more than 2 terms. A special election was held on November 10, 1970, to elect the convention delegates. The convention was convened on June 1, 1971, at Quezon City Hall. A total of 320 delegates were elected. The most prominent were former Senators Raul Manglapus and Roseller T. Lim. Other delegates later became influential political figures, including Hilario Davide Jr., Marcelo Fernan, Sotero Laurel, Aquilino Pimentel Jr., Teofisto Gingona Jr., Raul Rocco, Edgardo Angara, Richard Gordon, Margarito Teves, and Federico Della Plana. By 1972, the convention had become bogged down by politicking and delays. Its credibility fell further in May 1972 when a delegate exposed a bribery scheme in which delegates were paid to vote in favor of the Marcoses. First Lady Imelda Marcos became implicated in the alleged scheme. The investigation was shelved when Marcos declared martial law in September 1972 and had 11 opposition delegates arrested. The remaining opposition delegates were forced to go either into exile or hiding. Within 2 months, an entirely new draft of the Constitution was created by a special committee. The 1973 constitutional plebiscite was called to ratify the new Constitution, but the validity of the ratification was brought to question because Marcos replaced secret ballot voting with a system of viva voce voting by citizens' assemblies. The ratification of the Constitution was challenged in the ratification cases. CPP New People's Army on December 29, 1970. Philippine Military Academy instructor Lieutenant Victor Corpus led New People's Army rebels in a raid on the PMA Armory, capturing rifles, machine guns, grenade launchers, a bazooka, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. In 1972, China, which was then actively supporting and arming communist insurgencies in Asia as part of Mao Zedong's People's War Doctrine, transported 1,200 M 14 and AK-47 rifles aboard the MV Karagotten for the NPA to aid its campaign to defeat the government. Rumored coup d'etat and assassination plot. A report by the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee said that shortly after the presidential election, a group composed mostly of retired colonels and generals organized a revolutionary junta with the aim of discrediting and killing Marcos. The group was headed by Eleuterio Adavoso, a Liberal Party official. A document given to the committee by a Philippine government official alleged that Vice President Fernando Lopez and Sergio Osmeña Jr. were key figures in the plot. As early as December 1969, in a message from the U.S. ambassador to the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, the ambassador said that most of the talk about revolution and even assassination had been coming from the defeated opposition, of which Adavoso was a leading activist. He also said that his information on the assassination plans was hard and he wanted it to reach President Marcos. Plaza Miranda bombing. The Plaza Miranda bombing, Filipino, Pambo Bomba sa Luisang Miranda, occurred during a political rally of the Liberal Party at Plaza Miranda, Quiapo District, Manila, the Philippines on August 21, 1971. It caused 9 deaths and injured 95 others, including many prominent Liberal Party politicians. Unnamed former Communist Party officials alleged that the Communist Party leadership planned, and 3 operatives carried out, the Plaza Miranda attack in an attempt to provoke government repression and push the country towards revolution. Communist leader Jose Maria Sison had calculated that Marcos could be provoked into cracking down on his opponents, thereby driving political activists into the underground, the unnamed former officials said. Recruits were urgently needed, they said, to make use of a large influx of weapons and financial aid that China had agreed to provide. Sison denied these claims. The CPP never offered official confirmation of its culpability. Marcos and his allies claimed that Benigno Aquino Jr. was part of the plot, a claim denied by Sison. Some historians claim Marcos was responsible for the Plaza Miranda bombing, as he is known to have used false flag operations as a pretext for martial law. U.S. intelligence documents declassified in the 1990s contained evidence implicating Marcos, provided by a CIA mole within the Philippine Army. Another false flag attack took place with the attempted assassination of Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile in 1972. President Nixon approved Marcos's subsequent martial law initiative, 1971 suspension of habeas corpus on August 21st. Marcos issued Proclamation No. 889, through which he assumed emergency powers and suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Marcos's act forced many members of the moderate opposition, such as Edgar Jobson, to join the radicals. In the aftermath of the bombing, Marcos lumped all of the opposition together and referred to them as communists. Many former moderates fled to the radicals' mountain encampments to avoid arrest by Marcos's forces. Those disenchanted with the Marcos administration often joined the ranks of the radicals as the only group vocally opposing Marcos. 1972 Manila bombings. The 1972 Manila bombings were a series of about 20 explosions in Metro Manila in the months after the Plaza Miranda bombing and immediately preceding Ferdinand Marcos's proclamation of martial law. The first of these bombings took place on March 15, 1972, and the last took place on September 11, 1972, 12 days before martial law was announced on September 23rd of that year. The Marcos administration officially attributed the explosions to communist urban guerrillas, and Marcos included them in the list of inciting events that served as rationalizations for martial law. Marcos's political opposition questioned the attribution of the explosions to the communists, knowing that the only suspects caught in connection to the explosions were linked to the Philippine constabulary. Bombing sites included the Palace Theater and Joe's department store on Carriedo Street, both in Manila, the offices of the Philippine Long Distance Telephone Company, PLDT, Filipinas Orient Airways, and Philippine American Life, and General Insurance Company, Philem Life. The Cubao branch of the Philippine Trust Company, now known as PhilTrust Bank, the Senate Publication Division and the Philippine Sugar Institute in Quezon City, and the South Vietnamese Embassy. The incident in the Carriedo shopping mall killed 1 woman and injured about 40. the only incident involving casualties. Martial law era, 1972 to 1981. On the evening of September 23, 1972, the president declared martial law for the Philippines. This marked the beginning of a 14-year period of one-man rule lasting until Marcos went into exile on February 25, 1986. Even though martial law was formally lifted on January 17, 1981, Marcos retained virtually all of his powers until he was ousted by the EDSA revolution. The first of these bombings took place on March 15, 1972, and the last took place on September 11, 1972, 12 days before martial law was announced on September 23 of that year. The declaration became known on September 23, 1972, when Press Secretary Francisco Tatat announced that Proclamation No. 1081 would extend Marcos's rule beyond the two-term constitutional limit. Ruling by decree, he almost dissolved press freedom and other civil liberties, closed down Congress and the media, and ordered the arrest of opposition leaders and militant activists, including Benigno Aquino Jr., Jovito Salonga, and Jose W. Diokno. Marcos claimed that martial law was the prelude to creating his Bagong Lipunan, a new society based on new social and political values. The early years of martial law met public approval, as it was believed to have caused crime rates to drop. Arrests, however, unlike Ninoy Aquino's Senate colleagues who were detained without charges, Ninoy, together with communist NPA leaders LT. Corpus and Bernabe Buscaino, was charged with murder, illegal possession of firearms, and subversion. Bagong Lipunan, New Society. One of Marcos's rationalizations for martial law stated that there was a need to reform society by placing it under the control of a benevolent dictator who could guide the undisciplined populace through a period of chaos. He referred to this social engineering exercise as the Bagong Lipunan, or New Society. His administration produced propaganda materials including speeches, books, lectures, slogans, and numerous propaganda songs to promote it. According to Marcos's book notes on the New Society, his movement urged the poor and the privileged to work as one for the common goals of society and to achieve the liberation of the Filipino people through self-realization. The Marcos regime instituted a youth organization known as Kabatang Barangay, which was led by Marcos's eldest daughter, Me. Presidential Decree 684, enacted in April 1975, encouraged youths aged 15 to 18 to go to camps and do volunteer work. In October 1974, Marcos and PKP 1930 entered into a national unity agreement by which PKP 1930 would support new society programs such as land reform, trade union reform, and revitalize Soviet bloc relations. Filipinization of Chinese schools to instill patriotism among Filipino citizens and prevent the growing number of Chinese schools from propagating foreign ideologies. Marcos issued Presidential Decree No. 176, preventing educational institutions from being established exclusively for foreigners or from offering curriculum exclusively for foreigners. It restricted Chinese language instruction to not more than 100 minutes per day. 1973 referendum martial law was put to a vote in the 1973 Philippine martial law referendum, which was marred with controversy, resulting in 90.77% support. Rolex 12 and the military along with Marcos, members of his Rolex 12 circle such as Defense Minister Juan Ponce Enrile, Chief of the Philippine Constabulary Fidel Ramos, and Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces of the Philippines Fabian Ver were the chief administrators of martial law. The three remained Marcos' closest advisors until he was ousted. Peripheral members of the Rolex 12 included Eduardo, Danding Cojuangco Jr., and Lucio Tan. Between 1972 and 1976, Marcos increased the size of the Philippine military from 65,000 to 270,000 personnel. In response to South Vietnam falling into the hands of North Vietnam and other communist successes in Southeast Asia, military officers were placed on the boards of media corporations, public utilities, development projects, and other private corporations, most of whom were highly educated graduates of the Philippine Military Academy. Marcos also supported the growth of a domestic weapons manufacturing industry and increased military spending. Many human rights abuses were attributed to the Philippine Constabulary, then headed by future President Fidel V. Ramos. Marcos organized the Civilian Home Defense Force, precursor of the Civilian Armed Forces Geographical Unit CAFGU, to battle communist and Islamic insurgencies. It was accused of inflicting human rights violations on leftists, the NPA, Muslim insurgents, and rebels. U.S. foreign policy. By 1977, the armed forces had quadrupled, and over 60,000 Filipinos had been arrested for political reasons. In 1981, Vice President George H.W. Bush praised Marcos for his adherence to democratic principles and to the democratic process. No American military or politician in the 1970s ever publicly questioned Marcos' authority to fight communism in Southeast Asia. From the declaration of martial law in 1972 until 1983, the U.S. government provided $2.5 billion in bilateral military and economic aid to Marcos, and about $5.5 billion through multilateral institutions such as the World Bank. During the Carter administration, 1977 to 1981, the relationship with the U.S. had soured somewhat when Carter targeted the Philippines in his human rights campaign. Despite this, the Carter administration provided military aid to the Marcos regime. A 1979 U.S. Senate report stated that U.S. officials were aware, as early as 1973, that Philippine government agents were in the United States to harass Filipino dissidents. In June 1981, two anti-Marcos labor activists were assassinated outside a union hall in Seattle. On at least one occasion, CIA agents blocked FBI investigations of Philippine agents. By 1984, U.S. President Ronald Reagan started distancing himself from the Marcos regime that he and previous American presidents had strongly supported even during martial law. The United States, which had provided hundreds of millions of dollars in aid, was crucial in buttressing Marcos' rule over the years. Switched from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China pre-Marcos, the Philippines had maintained a close relationship with Taiwan's Kuomintang-ruled Republic of China, ROC government. Prior administrations had seen the People's Republic of China, PRC, as a security threat, due to its financial and military support of communist rebels. By 1969, however, Ferdinand Marcos started publicly asserting the need for the Philippines to establish a diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China. In his 1969 State of the Nation address, he said, "We, in Asia, must strive toward a modus vivendi with Red China. I reiterate this need, which is becoming more urgent each day. Before long, Communist China will have increased its striking power 1,000-fold with a sophisticated delivery system for its nuclear weapons. We must prepare for that day. We must prepare to coexist peaceably with Communist China." In June 1975, President Marcos visited the PRC and signed a joint communiqué normalizing relations between the Philippines and China. Among other things, the communiqué stated that there is but one China and that Taiwan is an integral part of Chinese territory. In turn, Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai pledged that China would not intervene in the internal affairs of the Philippines nor seek to impose its policies in Asia, a move that isolated the local communist movement that China had financially and militarily supported. The Washington Post, in an interview with former Philippine Communist Party officials, stated that they wound up languishing in China for 10 years as unwilling guests of the government, feuding bitterly among themselves and with the party leadership in the Philippines. The government subsequently captured NPA leaders Bernabe Busqueno in 1976 and Jose Maria Sison in 1977. 1978 parliamentary election. By 1977, reports of gross human rights violations had led to pressure from the international community. U.S. President Jimmy Carter pressured the Marcos administration to release Ninoy Aquino and to hold parliamentary elections to demonstrate that some normalization had begun after the declaration of martial law. Marcos did not release Aquino, but announced that the 1978 Philippine parliamentary election would be held. The April 7th elections were for 166 of the 208 regional representatives to the interim Batasang Pambansa Parliament. The elections were contested by parties, including Ninoy Aquino's new party, the Lakas-ng Laban, and the regime's party known as the Kilusang Bagong Lipunan KBL. Laban fielded 21 candidates for the Metro Manila area, including Ninoy, activist Jerry Barican, labor leader Alex Bongkeo, Neptali Gonzalez, Teofisto Gingona Jr., Ramon Mitra Jr., Aquilino Pimentel Jr., journalist Napoleon Rama, publisher Alejandro Rosas, and poet-playwright Francisco Rodrigo. Irregularities noted during the election included pre-stuffed ballot boxes, phony registration, flying voters, manipulated election returns, and vote buying, and Laban's campaigning faced restrictions, including Marcos' refusal to let Aquino out of prison to campaign. All of the party's candidates, including Aquino, lost. Marcos' KBL party won 137 seats, while Pusion Baisaya, led by future Minority Floor leader Hilario Davide Jr., won 13 seats. Prime Minister in 1978, Ferdinand Marcos became Prime Minister of the Philippines, marking the return of the position for the first time since the terms of Pedro Paterno and Jorge Vargas during the American occupation. Based on Article 9 of the 1973 Constitution, it had broad executive powers typical of prime ministers in other countries. The position was the official head of government and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. All of the previous powers of the president from the 1935 Constitution were transferred to the prime minister. The prime minister also acted as head of the National Economic Development Authority. Upon his re-election to the presidency in 1981, Marcos was succeeded as prime minister by an American-educated leader and Wharton graduate, Cesar Vergara, who was elected as an assemblyman from Cavite in 1978. Proclamation 2045, after amending the Constitution and enacting legislative changes, Marcos issued Proclamation 2045, which lifted martial law on January 17, 1981, without restoring habeas corpus for rebellion and subversion-related crimes. The lifting of martial law was synchronized with the election of U.S. President Ronald Reagan and the visit of Pope John Paul II to get support from Reagan and minimize papal criticism. Third term, 1981 to 1986. On June 16, 1981, 6 months after lifting martial law, the first presidential election in 12 years was held. President Marcos ran while the major opposition parties, the United Nationalist Democratic Organizations, UNIDO, a coalition of opposition parties, and Laban boycotted the election. Marcos won a massive victory. Marcos' third inauguration took place on Tuesday, June 30, 1981, at the Quirino Grandstand in Manila. Then U.S. Vice President George H. W. Bush, Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, future President of China Yang Shankin, and Thai Prime Minister Prem Tinsulananda attended. At the inauguration, Bush famously praised Marcos. "We love your adherence to democratic principles and to the democratic process." Armed conflict with the CPP, NPA under martial law, the Communist Party of the Philippines, and the New People's Army experienced significant growth. This continued into the 1980s. The NPA established itself in urban areas, while the NDF formed relationships with legal opposition organizations, all despite Marcos' claims in January 1981 that the conflict had been substantially contained. The killing of key leaders in Davao City in the opening years of the 1980s led the administration to claim that the CPP backbone in the South had broken, but the remaining leaders soon began to experiment with new tactics, including urban insurrection, leading the international press to label Davao City as the killing fields and as the Philippines' murder capital. The violence reached its peak in 1985 with 1,282 military and police deaths and 1,362 civilian deaths. Recession. The Marcos administration spending had relied heavily on debt since Marcos' first term in the 1960s. This left the Philippines vulnerable when high inflation caused the U.S. to raise interest rates from 1980 to 1982, which in turn caused U.S. recessions in 1980 and 1981. The Philippine economy went into decline in 1981. Economic and political instability combined to produce the worst recession in Philippine history in 1984 and 1985, with the economy contracting by 7.3% for 2 successive years and poverty incidence at 49%. Aquino assassination on August 21, 1983. Opposition leader Benigno Aquino Jr. was assassinated on the tarmac at Manila International Airport. He had returned to the Philippines after 3 years in exile in the United States, where he had undergone a heart bypass operation after Marcos allowed him to leave the country for medical care. Prior to his heart surgery, Ninoy, along with his 2 co-accused MPA leaders Bernabe Buscaino, Commander Dante, and Lieutenant Victor Corpus, was sentenced to death by a military commission on charges of murder, illegal possession of firearms, and subversion. A few months before his assassination, Ninoy had decided to return to the Philippines after his research fellowship at Harvard University ended. The opposition blamed Marcos directly for the assassination, while others blamed the military and Imelda Marcos. Popular speculation pointed to 3 suspects. The first was Marcos himself through his military chief Fabian Ver. The second theory pointed to Imelda, who had her own ambitions as her ailing husband seemed to be growing weaker. And the third was that Danding Cojuangco planned the assassination to serve his own political ambitions. The 1985 acquittals of Ver and other high-ranking military officers charged with the crime were widely seen as a whitewash and a miscarriage of justice. On November 22, 2007, Pablo Martinez, one of the soldiers convicted in the Aquino assassination, alleged that Marcos' crony Danding Cojuangco had ordered the assassination while Marcos was recuperating from his kidney transplant. Cojuangco was a cousin of Aquino's wife, Corazon Cojuangco Aquino. Martinez alleged that only he and Galman knew of the assassination, and that Galman was the actual shooter, although this is not corroborated by other evidence. After the February 1986 People Power Revolution that brought Aquino's widow to the presidency, the Supreme Court ordered a reinvestigation of the assassination. The Sandigambian convicted 16 military personnel for the murder, ruling that Constable First Class Rogelio Moreno, one of the military escorts assigned to Aquino, fired the fatal shot that killed Aquino, not Galman. Impeachment attempt in August 1985. 56 assemblymen signed a resolution calling for the impeachment of President Marcos for alleged diversion of U.S. aid for personal use, citing a San Jose Mercury News expose of the Marcos family's multimillion-dollar U.S. investments and property holdings. The properties included the Crown Building, Lindenmere Estate, residential apartments, a shopping center, mansions in London, Rome, and Honolulu, the Helen Knudsen Estate, and 3 condominiums. The complaint also cited the misuse and misapplication of funds for the construction of the Manila Film Center, where X-rated and pornographic films are exhibited, contrary to public morals and Filipino customs and traditions. The impeachment attempt gained little traction. The committee to which the resolution was referred did not recommend impeachment, and momentum for removing Marcos through constitutional processes soon dissipated. Physical decline during his 3rd term. Marcos' health deteriorated rapidly due to kidney ailments, a complication of chronic lupus erythematosus. He had a kidney transplant in August 1983, and when his body rejected the first kidney, he underwent a second transplant in November 1984. A palace physician who alleged that Marcos had undergone a kidney transplant was shortly thereafter found murdered. Police said he was kidnapped and slain by communist rebels. Many questioned whether Marcos had the capacity to govern, given his illness and the escalating political unrest. With Marcos ailing, Imelda emerged as the government's main public figure. Economic performance, the economic history of the Philippines during the Marcos regime, 1965 to 1986, was a period of economic stress. On the other hand, the partial 69% tally of the National Movement for Free Elections, NAMFREL, an accredited poll watcher, had Aquino winning with 7,502,601 votes against Marcos' 6,787,556 votes. Cheating was reported on both sides. This electoral exercise was marred by widespread reports of violence and election tampering. The fraud culminated in the walkout of 35 Comelec computer technicians to advance their claim that the official election results were manipulated to favor Ferdinand Marcos, according to their testimonies, which were never validated. The walkout was led by Linda Kapunen, and the technicians were protected by Reform the Armed Forces Movement, RAM, officers led by her husband, Lieutenant Colonel Eduardo Red Kapunen. In the last months of Marcos' administration, the Soviet Union stepped up relations and was the only major country to officially congratulate Marcos on his disputed election victory. Marcos had provided favors to the Soviets, such as allowing the banned Philippine Communist Party to visit the Soviet Union for consultations. A UPI article from March 1986 reported, diplomats in Moscow believe the Soviet government totally misjudged Marcos' power to control events. They speculate that Moscow considered his control of legal bodies and his readiness to be ruthless would thwart any popular opposition. 1986 RAM coup and People Power Revolution main articles. February 1986 Reform the Armed Forces Movement coup and People Power Revolution. The neutrality of this section is disputed. The election gave a decisive boost to the People Power movement. Edralin and Ramos later abandoned Marcos, switched sides and sought protection behind the 1986 People Power Revolution, backed by fellow American educator Eugenio Lopez Jr., Jaime Augusto Zobel de Ayala, and the old political and economic elites. RAM, led by Lieutenant Colonel Gregorio Gringo Honasan and backed by Edralin, had plotted a coup d'etat to seize Malacanang and kill Marcos and his family. At the height of the revolution, Edralin claimed that a purported ambush attempt against him years earlier was in fact faked, in order for Marcos to have a pretext for imposing martial law. Edralin later retracted this statement, and in 2012, he claimed that the ambush was real. Marcos continually maintained that he was a duly elected president for a fourth term, but unfairly and illegally deprived of his right to serve it. On February 25, 1986, rival presidential inaugurations were held, but as Aquino supporters overran parts of Manila and seized state broadcaster PTV4, Marcos was forced to flee. Exile in Hawaii, 1986 to 1989, fleeing to Hawaii, Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos at the White House with U.S. President Ronald Reagan in 1982 at 1500 hours Pacific Standard Time, GMT plus 8, on February 25, 1986, Marcos talked to United States Senator Paul Laxalt, a close associate of President Reagan, asking for advice. Laxalt advised him to cut and cut cleanly, to which Marcos expressed his disappointment. In the afternoon, Marcos talked to Edralin, asking for safe passage for him and his family, including close allies such as General Ver. Finally, at 9 p.m., the Marcos family was transported by four Sikorsky HH-3E helicopters to Clark Air Base in Angeles City, about 83 kilometers north of Manila, before boarding U.S. Air Force C. 130 planes bound for Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, and finally to Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, where Marcos arrived on February 26th. He also brought with him 22 crates of cash valued at $717 million, 300 crates of assorted jewelry, $4 million worth of unset precious gems, 65 Seiko and Cartier watches, a 12-by-4-foot box full of pearls, a 3-foot solid gold statue covered in diamonds and other precious stones, $200,000 in gold bullion, nearly $1 million in Philippine pesos, and deposit slips to banks in the United States, Switzerland, and the Cayman Islands worth $124 million. Initially, there was confusion in Washington as to what to do with Marcos and the 90 members of his entourage. Given the special relations Marcos nurtured with Reagan, the former had expectations of favorable treatment. However, Reagan kept his distance. The State Department in turn assigned former Deputy Chief of Mission to Manila, Robert G. Rich Jr., to be the point of contact. The entourage were first billeted inside the housing facilities of Hickam Air Force Base. The State Department announced the Marcoses were not immune from legal charges, and within weeks hundreds of cases had been filed against them. Throughout his stay in Hawaii, he and his family enjoyed a high life, living in a luxurious house in Makiki Heights, as Imelda entertained guests at parties, while Filipinos back in the Philippines suffered under the debt Marcos incurred. When protesters stormed Malacanang Palace shortly after their departure, It was notoriously discovered that Imelda had left behind over 2,700 pairs of shoes. The protesters looted and vandalized the palace. Many stole documents, jewelry, food, typewriters, etc. The Catholic hierarchy and Manila's middle class were crucial to the success of the revolution. Contrary to the widely held notion that the protests were limited to Manila, protests against Marcos also occurred in the provinces and on the islands of Visayas and Mindanao. Plans to return and the Marcos tapes, more than a year after the revolution. It was revealed to the United States House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee in 1987 that Marcos held an intention to return to the Philippines and overthrow the Aquino government. American attorney Richard Hirschfeld and business consultant Robert Chastain, both of whom pose as arms dealers, gained knowledge of a plot by gaining Marcos' trust and secretly recorded their conversations with the ousted leader. According to Hirschfeld, he was first invited by Marcos to a party held at the latter's family residence in Honolulu. After hearing that one of Hirschfeld's clients was Saudi Sheikh Mohammed Fassi, Marcos' interest was piqued because he had done business with Saudis in the past. A few weeks later, Marcos asked for help with securing a passport from another country in order to travel to the Philippines while bypassing travel restrictions imposed by the Philippines and United States governments. This failed, however, and subsequently Marcos asked Hirschfeld to arrange a $10 million loan from Fassi. On January 12, 1987, Marcos stated to Hirschfeld that he required another $5 million loan in order to pay 10,000 soldiers $500 each as a form of combat life insurance. When asked by Hirschfeld if he was talking about an invasion of the Philippines, Marcos responded, "Yes." Hirschfeld stated that Marcos said that he was negotiating with several arms dealers to purchase up to $18 million worth of weapons, including tanks and heat-seeking missiles, and enough ammunition to last an army 3 months. Marcos had thought of flying to his hometown in Ilocos Norte and initiating a plot to kidnap Corazon Aquino. "What I would like to see happen is we take her hostage," Marcos told Chastain. "Not to hurt her. No reason to hurt her. To take her." Learning of this plan, Hirschfeld contacted the U.S. Department of Justice and was asked for further evidence. This information eventually reached President Ronald Reagan, who placed Marcos under island arrest, further limiting his movement. Legal cases within 2 weeks of his arrival in the United States. Hundreds of criminal and civil cases against the Marcos clique were filed in Hawaii, San Francisco, and New York. Marcos made personal appeals to Reagan to put a stop to these cases. In June 1988, National Security Advisor Colin Powell recommended proceeding with indictments of the Marcoses as he reviewed the cases as forwarded by United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York Rudy Giuliani. Reagan tacitly approved. It was subsequently destroyed, allegedly by left-wing activists, members of a local tribe who had been displaced by construction of the monument, and looters hunting for the legendary Yamashita treasure. Students of the Ateneo de Manila University protesting the burial of Marcos on November 18, 2016, his remains were reburied at the Libinganing MGA Bayani ordered by President Rodrigo Duterte despite opposition from various groups. On the morning of November 18th, using Philippine Armed Forces helicopters, his family and their supporters flew his remains from Ilocos to Manila for a private burial. This account was challenged and the physical location of his remains is disputed. Various groups protested the burial. Trials and Reparations Roxas versus Marcos Rogelio Roxas, a Filipino treasure hunter, discovered a 3-foot-tall golden Buddha statue in tunnels under the Baguio General Hospital in 1971. Roxas was later arrested and tortured by members of the military, and the statue was taken away. Upon exile of the Marcoses, Roxas assigned his rights to a friend in the United States and formed the Golden Buddha Corporation GBC, who pursued the case against the former president. In 1996, the lower court awarded $22 billion in favor of GBC, making this the largest award in a civil case in U.S. history. In November 1998, the Hawaii Supreme Court overturned the ruling, but maintained an award of $6 million for the illegal arrest and torture experienced by Roxas. Sandagambian, Supreme Court and International Trials on November 9, 2018. Imelda Marcos was found guilty beyond reasonable doubt by the Sandagambian of 7 counts of graft for private organizations set up in Switzerland during her time as a government official from 1968 to 1986. In less than 20 days, the Sandagambian listed Imelda's advanced age and health condition as considerations for allowing the accused to post bail. The Fifth Division's ruling read that the fact that she is of advanced age and for health reasons, consistent with the doctrine in Edralin versus Sandagambian, bail is allowed for these 7 cases. The Supreme Court of the Philippines affirmed that the family's assets, beyond their government salaries, are considered as ill-gotten wealth. In 1998, the court acquitted Imelda Marcos of corruption charges from a previous graft conviction in 1993. The U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals confirmed a contempt judgment in relation to the assets of Imelda and her son Bongbong. Although on a different matter, this judgment awarded $353.6 million to human rights victims, which was arguably the largest contempt award ever affirmed by an appellate court. Reparations in 1995, some 10,000 Filipinos won a U.S. class action lawsuit filed against the Marcos estate. The claims were filed by victims or their surviving relatives consequent on torture, execution, and disappearances. The Swiss government, initially reluctant to respond to allegations that stolen funds were held in Swiss accounts, returned $684 million of Marcos's holdings. Corazon Aquino repealed many of the repressive laws enacted during Marcos's dictatorship. She restored the right of habeas corpus, repealed anti-labor laws, and freed hundreds of political prisoners. From 1989 to 1996, a series of suits were brought before U.S. courts against Marcos and his daughter Amy, alleging that they bore responsibility for executions, torture, and disappearances. A jury in the Ninth Circuit Court awarded $2 billion to the plaintiffs and to a class composed of human rights victims and their families. On June 12, 2008, in Republic of Philippines versus Pimentel, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that the judgment of the Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit is reversed, and the case is remanded with instructions to order the district court to dismiss the interpleader action. The court dismissed the interpleader lawsuit filed to determine the rights of 9,500 Filipino human rights victims, 1972 to 1986, to recover $35 million, part of a $2 billion judgment in U.S. courts against the Marcos estate, because the Philippines government is an indispensable party, protected by sovereign immunity. The Philippines government claimed ownership of the funds transferred by Marcos in 1972 to Edralin S.A., which invested the money with Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner and Smith Incorporated in New York. In July 2017, the Philippine Court of Appeals rejected the petition seeking to enforce the United States court decision. In 2013, Philippine Congress passed Republic Act 10368, or the Human Rights Victims Reparation and Recognition Act of 2013. The law created the Human Rights Violations Claims Board and provided reparations to victims of summary execution, torture, enforced disappearances, and other human rights violations. Compensation came from $10 billion of stolen wealth seized by the government from the Marcoses. A total of 11,103 victims received compensation in 2018. A bill filed in Congress in 2020 proposed to compensate tens of thousands of people still not officially recognized as victims of state-sponsored violence. Legacy Marcos left a legacy of debt, hardship, and repression. Human rights abuses. The Marcos regime committed human rights abuses against a long list of opponents. These included student activists such as Edgar Jobson and Rigoberto Tiglao, farmers such as Bernabe Buscaino, journalists such as Satter Ocampo, legal political opponents such as Ninoy Aquino, fellow candidates such as Alex Bonqueo, and priests and nuns. Victims were commonly accused of supporting communist rebels or other leftists, or of joining or sympathizing with the CPP, NPA, or MNLF. Victims were rounded up without an arrest warrant and indefinitely detained without charge. In a keynote speech at the University of the East, journalist Risa Robles described how anyone could be arrested or abducted with ease through ARRS search and seizure orders ASSO, which allowed the military or police to detain anyone, according to Rappler Research. A 1976 Amnesty International report listed 88 government torturers, including members of the Philippine Constabulary and the Philippine Army, which was under the direct control of Major General Ramos and Defense Minister Enrile. According to Rigoberto Tiglao, nearly all of the human rights abuses were committed by Philippine Constabulary units, especially through its national network of constabulary security units, whose heads reported directly to Ramos. The most dreaded of these was the Manila-based 5th Constabulary Security Unit CSU, which featured dreaded torture Lieutenant Rodolfo Aguinaldo, which was credited with capturing most of the Communist Party leaders, including Sison and the Manila Rizal Regional Committee he headed. The Metrocom Intelligence and Security Group MISG, under the command of Colonel Rolando Abadilla, and the Intelligence Service ISAF. The various estimates of the scale of abuses include Task Force Detainees of the Philippines, TFDP, 2,668 incidents of arrest, 398 disappearances, 1,338 salvagings, 128 frustrated salvagings, 1,499 killed or wounded in massacres, Amnesty International 70,000 imprisoned, 34,000 tortured, 3,240 documented as killed. Historian Alfred McCoy gives a figure of 3,257 recorded extrajudicial killings by the military from 1975 to 1985, 35,000 tortured, and 70,000 incarcerated. Bulletin newspaper estimates 120,000 victims of arbitrary arrest and detention, and 1,500 extrajudicial executions of activists under martial law. Human rights group Karapan recorded 759. In addition to these, up to 10,000 Moro Muslims were killed in massacres by the Philippine Army, Philippine Constabulary, and the Ilaga pro-government paramilitary group. Victims were often taken to military safe houses, where abductees were tortured, often blindfolded. In a document titled Open Letter to the Filipino People, martial law martyr Edgar Egypt Jobson described them. Safe houses usually have their windows always shut tight. They are usually covered with high walls. One would usually detect safe houses through the traffic of motorcycles and cars, going in and out of the house at irregular hours. Burly men, armed with pistols tucked in their waists or in clutch bags, usually drive these vehicles. Various forms of torture were used by the military, typically in combination. Killing see also extrajudicial killings and forced disappearances in the Philippines. Number of salvage cases, TFDP. Year no of cases 1981-39, 198-1218, 198-2210, 198-3368, 198-4538, total 1,473 summary executions were common. Bodies were often recovered bearing signs of torture and mutilation. Such cases were referred to as salvaging, a term widely believed to be derived from the Spanish word salvaje, meaning savage. Mutilated remains were often dumped on roadsides in order to instill fear and to intimidate opponents. Anyone could be salvaged, communists, suspects, innocent civilians, and priests included. TFDP documented 1,473 salvage cases from 1980 to 1984 alone. Victims included Pamansaning, Lungsoding, Maynila student Liliosa Hileo, Archimedes Trajano, Juan Iskander, and 16-year-old Luis Manuel Boyet Maharez, whose body was found with burn marks, all his nails removed, 33 ice pick wounds, skull crushed, eyeballs gouged out, and genitals mutilated before he was dropped from a helicopter. Enforced disappearances, also known as desaparecidos or the disappeared. People who suddenly went missing, sometimes without a trace, and whose bodies were never recovered. Victims include Primitivo Tibua Maharez, Emmanuel Alvarez, Albert Enriquez Ma, Leticia Ladlad, Herman Lagman, Mariano Lopez, Rodolo Manoag, Manuel Ontong, Florencio Pesquesa, Arnulfo Rhesus, Rosalio Romano, Carlos Taig, Emmanuel Yap, Jan Quimpo, Rizalina Logan, Christina Catala, Jessica Sales, and Ramon Jazzle. While the numbers of political detainees went down, the number of people killed rose and spiked in 1981. The year martial law was officially lifted by Marcos, according to task force detainees of the Philippines. According to Senator Jose W. Diokno, as torture cases declined, a more terrible tactic emerged: unofficial executions. Suspected dissidents were simply arrested and vanished.